The case study that changed everything. Ethan Graham was an ordinary criminology student, juggling late-night study sessions and part-time shifts at the local diner. When his professor assigned a new project, a real-life case study, Ethan was less than thrilled. He wanted to focus on something simple, maybe a small-town burglary or a cold case about missing pets. But when he stumbled across a local rumor about unidentified beings near an abandoned cabin in the woods, his curiosity got the better of him. The stories were bizarre. Some claimed to see glowing eyes in the darkness. Others spoke of strange footprints and claw marks near the cabin. Most dismissed it as drunken hallucinations or pranks, but Ethan saw an opportunity. "This will either get me an A or an epic story to tell," he muttered, stuffing his backpack with a flashlight, notebooks, and a cheap voice recorder. The trek to the cabin was uneventful at first. The woods were eerily quiet, the crunch of his boots on dry leaves the only sound. The deeper he ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Shadows danced between the trees, and the wind carried faint, whispering noises that didn't sound natural. Ethan's heart raced, but he shook off the feeling. Just the wind, he told himself. Still, he tightened his grip on the flashlight. When he reached the cabin, it looked as abandoned as the rumors described. Broken windows, a door hanging off its hinges, and vines creeping up the walls. The air around it felt colder, as if the place rejected the warmth of the sun. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But his curiosity and his grade pushed him forward. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Furniture lay overturned, and claw marks gouged the wooden walls. Ethan pulled out his recorder. "Cabin appears to have signs of a struggle," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He moved deeper, shining his flashlight around. A faint smell of burnt metal lingered in the air. It didn't match anything he'd encountered before, and it made him uneasy. As he approached the back room, a sudden noise stopped him cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a shuffling sound like someone, or something, trying to stay quiet. Ethan froze, every nerve on high alert. "Hello," he called, his voice breaking slightly. No response. He stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling in his hands. The shuffling grew louder, and then he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the beam of light. They were large, unblinking, and unlike anything human. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light. It was a girl, at least she looked like one. Her skin was pale with a faint shimmer, her features sharp and otherworldly. She wore a tattered cloak that barely concealed her thin frame. Most striking were her hands, which ended in delicate claws, and her eyes, which glowed faintly like molten silver. She stared at him, her body tense, ready to bolt. Hi," Ethan managed, holding up his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The girl tilted her head, watching him carefully. Her lips moved, but the sounds she made were incomprehensible, a mix of clicks and melodic hums. Ethan tried again. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just wanted to check this place out." He pointed to himself and said, "Ethan." Then he pointed at her, hoping she'd understand. She hesitated, then pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Lixa. "Lixa," Ethan repeated, nodding. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. Relieved that she wasn't attacking him, Ethan lowered his flashlight slightly. But before he could say anything else, Lixa's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground. Ethan rushed forward, instinct overriding his fear. Up close, he saw that her skin was bruised, and her breathing was shallow. She was injured. "What happened to you?" he whispered, though he didn't expect an answer. Lixa's eyes fluttered open briefly, and she grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She said something in her strange language, her tone urgent and pleading. Ethan didn't understand her words, but he understood the desperation in her eyes. He knew he couldn't leave her here. "All right, Lixa," he said, more to himself than her. "Let's get you out of here." He helped her to her feet, surprised at how light she was. Supporting her weight, he led her out of the cabin and into the woods. As they moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind carried unfamiliar sounds, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Ethan quickened his pace, determined to get back to his car before whatever was out there decided to show itself. By the time they reached the car, Lixa was barely conscious. Ethan eased her into the passenger seat and started the engine, his mind racing. He didn't know who or what she was, but one thing was clear: she needed his help, and for better or worse, Ethan wasn't the type to turn his back on someone in need. As he drove back toward town, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't have anticipated. This was no ordinary case study, and somehow he knew that whatever was coming next would change everything. The alien's desperate plea. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his heart pounding as he watched the strange girl resting in his dorm room. Lixa, as she called herself, was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her pale, shimmering skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and the sharp, claw-like tips of her fingers twitched as if she were dreaming. For a moment, he wondered if he had lost his mind. A criminology project had led him to an actual alien, or something close enough to it. She stirred, her silver eyes snapping open. Ethan tensed, unsure of what to expect. Would she attack? Run? But instead, Lixa pushed herself upright, wincing as she clutched her side. The faint bruising on her skin seemed darker now, almost black. Whatever had hurt her, it wasn't human. Lixa, Ethan said softly, his voice a careful mix of calm and concern. He gestured to his chest. Ethan. Her gaze flickered to him, cautious but not hostile. She opened her mouth, her voice a series of melodic tones and clicks that made no sense to him. Frustration crossed her face, and she clenched her fists, clearly struggling to communicate. Okay, Ethan said, grabbing his phone. He opened a translation app, unsure if it would even work. He gestured for her to speak again. Lixa hesitated, then tried again. The app struggled, processing the sounds as gibberish before spitting out a crude approximation. Danger. Follow. Must hide. Ethan frowned. Danger? What kind of danger? He pointed at her, then mimicked running and looking scared. Someone after you. Lixa nodded, her expression growing urgent. She grabbed his hand, her clawed fingers surprisingly gentle despite their sharpness. She spoke again, this time slower, and the app caught more. Hunted. Wrong choice. Cannot return. The word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Hunted by who? He asked, his voice shaking. Or by what? Instead of answering, Lixa gestured to her cloak and pulled out a small metallic device. It looked like a cross between a compass and a watch, glowing faintly with blue symbols that shifted as she pressed a button. A hologram flickered to life above it, showing a sleek, menacing ship descending through a stormy sky. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the coordinates displayed. They were for this area. They're here, Ethan whispered, his stomach twisting. They're looking for you. Lixa nodded again, her breathing quickening. She said something in her alien tongue, her tone rising in panic. The app translated clumsily. Cannot fight. Help me hide. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to back out now, to call someone. Anyone, and let them deal with this. But there was something in Lixa's eyes, a deep desperation that he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just some creature from another world. She was afraid, vulnerable, and for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend. She trusted him. All right, Ethan said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. I'll help you, but you need to trust me too. He stood and grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with essentials, water, snacks, and a first aid kit. If they were going to hide, they needed to move fast. Can you walk? He asked. Lixa nodded, though she winced as she got to her feet. Ethan supported her, noticing how light she felt, almost weightless. Her injuries, however, were real. Dark liquid seeped through her cloak, staining his hand as he steadied her. It wasn't blood. Not exactly. It shimmered like mercury and evaporated quickly, leaving behind a faint metallic scent. They slipped out of the dorm under the cover of darkness, Ethan guiding Lixa through the back alleys and side streets. Every noise made his heart race. The thought of being caught by whatever was hunting her sent adrenaline surging through his veins. As they reached the edge of town, Lixa stopped suddenly, her body tense. She held up her device, and the hologram shifted to show a new warning, a pulsing red light accompanied by an ominous sound. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lixa pointed to the sky. Ethan followed her gaze, his stomach dropping as he saw a faint, circular light in the clouds above. It wasn't the moon. It was something far worse. "They found us," Lixa whispered, her voice trembling. This time, Ethan didn't need the translator to understand. Her tone said it all. Ethan swallowed hard, gripping Lixa's hand tighter. "Then we run." And with that, they vanished into the forest, the shadows swallowing them whole as the light above grew brighter, casting an eerie glow over the trees. Behind them, the faint hum of a descending ship sent a clear message. They were running out of time. Escape from the shadows. Ethan's dorm room was now a dangerous haven. The walls felt like they were closing in as he packed hastily, throwing essentials into his backpack. Lixa, seated on the edge of the bed, winced with every movement, her glowing silver eyes scanning the room as if expecting an attack at any moment. Her alien device hummed faintly on the desk, projecting a rotating hologram of their surroundings. Red blips moved closer to the center, each one a hunter's signal. The word she had managed to communicate earlier echoed in Ethan's mind. "Hunted. Cannot return." "Lixa," Ethan said, pulling on his jacket. "We can't stay here. If they find us." She raised a hand to stop him, her clawed fingers trembling. "Safe. Not here," she said, her voice halting as she forced the words out in broken English. It was clear she was picking up bits of his language, but the effort was draining her. Ethan nodded, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "Yeah, no kidding. Let's go before they make this place a crater." Helping Lixa to her feet, he noticed her legs were unsteady, her injuries worse than he'd realized. Her pale, shimmering skin seemed duller now, and her breaths were shallow. But there was no time to stop. He wrapped her arm around his shoulder, supporting her as they moved toward the door. The hall was eerily quiet, every creak of the old building amplified in the tense silence. As they crept down the stairs, Lixa's device beeped urgently. Ethan glanced at it, his stomach twisting. The red blips were almost on top of them. "Crap," he muttered. "We're out of time." Before they could reach the exit, a deafening crash echoed through the building. The walls shook, and the overhead lights flickered as a brilliant beam of light pierced the roof, cutting through the floors like a knife through paper. Ethan shielded his eyes, adrenaline surging as a robotic voice boomed through the air in an alien language. Lixa stiffened, her grip on Ethan tightening. She whispered a single word in his ear. "Run." He didn't need to be told twice. They bolted out of the building, Lixa staggering but determined to keep up. Behind them, a massive shadow descended from the sky, its outline illuminated by the harsh glow of searchlights. The ship was sleek and ominous, its engines emitting a low predatory hum. Ethan's sneakers pounded against the pavement as they dashed into the forest at the edge of town. The towering trees provided some cover, but the ship's lights sliced through the branches, sweeping the ground in search of its target. Ethan ducked behind a tree, pulling Lixa with him as a beam passed just inches away. "This is insane," he hissed, his chest heaving. "I'm a criminology student, not a fugitive." Lixa managed a faint, humorless smile. "Now, both." Ethan let out a dry laugh despite himself. "Great, just great." The ship's engines roared louder, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Lixa pulled out her device, her claws moving over the controls with precision despite her exhaustion. A blue pulse radiated from the device, and the lights above them flickered. The ship's searchlights dimmed momentarily, giving them a chance to move. "What did you do?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. "Delay only," she said, her voice weak. "Need distance." Ethan scanned their surroundings, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun the ship for long, not with Lixa injured, and the hunters this close. His eyes fell on a narrow ravine ahead, its steep sides lined with jagged rocks. "This way," he said, guiding Lixa toward the ravine. "We can lose them in there." The descent was treacherous. Loose stones slid beneath their feet, and Ethan had to steady Lixa more than once to keep her from falling. The ship's lights reappeared, sweeping the forest like relentless eyes. The hum of its engines grew louder, closer. "Come on," Ethan urged, his voice strained. "Just a little farther." They'd reached the bottom of the ravine, the dense undergrowth providing some cover. Ethan crouched behind a cluster of rocks, pulling Lixa down beside him. She was breathing hard, her silver eyes dim but focused. The device in her hand emitted a faint hum, its blue light fading. "What now?" Ethan whispered. Lixa met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You trust." Ethan blinked, taken aback. "Do I trust you? You're kidding, right? I've already risked my life for you." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she placed the device in his hand. "Not me, yourself." Before he could respond, a deafening roar shook the ravine. The ship's engines screamed as it descended into the narrow space, its searchlights piercing the darkness. Ethan's heart raced as the ground trembled beneath them. Lixa touched his arm, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Run, now." Ethan hesitated for only a second before grabbing her hand and darting deeper into the ravine. The ship followed, its lights narrowing in on them. But as they ran, Lixa's device began to glow again, its light pulsing in time with her rapid breaths. Ethan didn't understand what she was doing, but he trusted her. And as the ship's lights closed in, the device emitted a blinding flash of blue light, engulfing them in a protective shield. The ship's engines sputtered, and its lights dimmed as it hovered, confused. Ethan stared at Lixa, his chest heaving. What was that?" She smiled faintly, her strength fading. "Not enough. Need more." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the ship began to recover, its engines roaring to life. The hunters weren't giving up. And as Ethan looked at Lixa, he realized the battle had only just begun. A growing connection. The cabin they found deep in the forest was small and weathered, tucked away behind a thicket of ancient trees. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were coated in grime, but to Ethan and Lixa, it was a temporary sanctuary from the hunters. Ethan set his backpack down and helped Lixa onto the worn-out couch. She sank into the cushions with a sharp exhale, her face pale and strained. The faint glow of her skin had dimmed further, and the strange, silvery liquid that passed for her blood had soaked into her tattered cloak. "Stay here," Ethan said, his voice low. He moved around the cabin, checking for anything useful. The cupboards were mostly empty, save for some canned goods and a rusty first aid kit. He returned with a damp cloth and began cleaning the dried blood from her arms. Lixa flinched at first, but then relaxed, watching him closely. "Why? Help?" she asked, her words halting but clear enough. Ethan hesitated, meeting her glowing silver eyes. "Why wouldn't I?" he said, carefully dabbing at the wounds. "You needed help, and I was there. Isn't that reason enough?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Most. Run. Fear." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Oh, I'm definitely scared. But I don't think leaving you to fend for yourself would have been any less terrifying." Lixa's lips curved into a faint smile. "Strange. Human." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You have no idea." The tension between them eased as they shared the small, quiet space, Outside, the forest seemed alive with distant sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. But the hunter's ship was nowhere in sight, at least for now. After ensuring Lix's wounds were clean, Ethan sat across from her, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He couldn't help but notice the way her features softened when she wasn't on high alert. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way. "Where are you from?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I mean, your home. What's it like?" Lix's eyes dimmed slightly, and she looked away. Far, bright skies, endless towers. "No, free." "Not free." Ethan leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much she could trust him. Finally, she said, "Rules. No choice. Leave, forbidden." Ethan frowned. "So, you ran away." She nodded, her expression shadowed by a mix of guilt and defiance. "Chose. Own path. They, angry. Sent them." "Them being the hunters," Ethan said, his voice low. He glanced at the window, half expecting to see searchlights in the distance. "You risked everything just to get away." Lixa met his gaze, her eyes soft but firm. "Better, free, even, hunted." Her words struck a chord with Ethan. He couldn't imagine living a life without freedom, without the ability to make his own choices. The thought of it made his stomach twist. "I get it," he said quietly. "More than you know." As the hours passed, Ethan began to notice strange things. Lix's breathing seemed to sync with his own, and the faint shimmer of her skin grew brighter whenever he was near. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then she spoke. "You change," she said, pointing at him. Ethan blinked. "Change? What do you mean?" Lixa reached out, her clawed fingers brushing against his hand. A warm, tingling sensation spread up his arm, and he pulled back instinctively. "What was that?" he asked, his voice rising. "Connection," Lixa said, her tone calm. "You, close. My kind. Adapt. Merge." Ethan's eyes widened. "Wait, what are you saying? You're adapting to me." Lixa nodded. "Human. Strong. You affect me. I affect you." Ethan stood, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. "So this whole time, you've been, what? Changing to survive here?" "Yes," Lixa said simply, "but not just survive. Bond. Bond." Ethan stopped, staring at her. "What kind of bond?" Lixa hesitated, her eyes lowering. "Protect. Share. Life." The implications hit Ethan like a freight train. Whatever was happening between them wasn't just survival. It was something deeper, something he couldn't fully understand yet. And for the first time, he wondered if helping her had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Before he could say anything else, a loud crack echoed from outside. Both of them froze, their eyes locking. "They're here," Ethan whispered. Lix's silver eyes flared, and she reached for her device. "No, they close. We move." Ethan grabbed his backpack and nodded, his heart pounding. As they slipped out the back door and into the dense forest, one thought burned in his mind. This connection between them might be the key to their survival or their downfall. The unexpected revelation. The fire crackled faintly in the secluded cave Ethan had chosen as their latest hiding spot. The forest was no longer safe after their narrow escape from the hunters. The ship had calmed the area relentlessly, forcing them deeper into the wilderness. Ethan's body ached, and exhaustion clung to him, but his thoughts churned too much for rest. Lixa sat across from him, her shimmering skin reflecting the flickering flames. Her wounds were healing faster than Ethan thought possible, but her energy remained low. She fiddled with her alien device, her delicate claws tracing glowing symbols on its surface. "You've been quiet," Ethan said, breaking the silence. He handed her a bottle of water, unsure if she even needed it. "You're not usually this still." Lixa hesitated before taking the bottle, her silver eyes meeting his. Much, think. Yeah, no kidding, Ethan said with a humorless laugh. Like how we're being chased by intergalactic bounty hunters, or how you're apparently adapting to me. Her gaze flickered, and she looked away, guilt flashing across her face. Not plan. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Lixa set the device aside and leaned forward, her tone serious. My kind survive by bond. We connect, adapt to, other, stronger together. Ethan frowned. Okay, so this is about survival. I get that. But you keep talking about this bond. What exactly does that mean? Lixa hesitated, searching for the right words in his language. Bond. Not just body. Mind. Life. Share all. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Wait, you're saying we're merging? Like, permanently? She nodded slowly. You, human. Strong mind. Your kind. Not like others. Bond with you. Different. The firelight danced between them as her words sank in. Ethan struggled to process the weight of what she was saying. This wasn't just about her adapting to survive on Earth. This was something deeper, something irreversible. So, what happens to me? He asked, his voice quieter now. What happens if this bond continues? Lixa's eyes softened, but there was an undercurrent of sadness in her expression. You change. Not hurt, but become part of me. Part of you. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his heart racing. What does that even mean? She gestured toward him, her clawed fingers trembling slightly. Your body, already change. Your mind, feel me, yes. Ethan wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was undeniable. He'd noticed it ever since they left the cabin. The way he could sense her presence even when she wasn't near, the strange warmth in his chest whenever she looked at him. It wasn't normal, and now he understood why. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Ethan demanded, his voice sharp. Lixa flinched, guilt flooding her expression. Not mean to bond. Happen when close. No stop. Ethan slumped back against the cave wall, his mind spinning. This wasn't what he signed up for. He'd wanted to help her, to do the right thing, but now he was tangled in something far bigger than himself. Before he could respond, a sharp, piercing sound echoed through the cave. Lixa's device lit up, flashing red. Her body tensed as she grabbed it, her claws moving quickly over the controls. What now? Ethan asked, dread creeping into his voice. Lixa glanced at him, her expression grim. Hunters found us. Ethan felt his heart drop. How? We're miles from the last spot. She held up the device, which projected a hologram of their surroundings. The red blips were closing in fast. They track bond. Energy. Strong. Ethan cursed under his breath. So now it's my fault they're finding us. No, Lixa said quickly, her voice firm. Not fault. Bond. Protect too. Ethan stared at her, confused. Protect how? Before she could answer, the sound of engines roared above them, shaking the cave. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a beam of light cut through the darkness. The hunters were here. Later, Ethan shouted, grabbing his backpack. He pulled Lixa to her feet. We've got to move. They bolted out of the cave and into the forest, the ship's lights sweeping over the trees like giant spotlights. Ethan's legs burned as he ran, but he didn't dare slow down. Lixa clutched his arm, her breathing labored. As they sprinted through the undergrowth, a strange warmth spread through Ethan's chest. It wasn't fear or adrenaline. It was something else. He glanced at Lixa and saw her glowing brighter, her movements becoming steadier. What's happening? He asked, his voice strained. Bond. Protect, she said, her voice rising above the chaos. You feel it now. Ethan didn't have time to question her further. The ship's engines roared overhead, and a metallic claw descended, aiming to cut off their escape. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed Lixa and dove into a nearby ravine, rolling to a stop just as the claws slammed into the ground behind them. They lay there for a moment, catching their breath. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears, but the warmth in his chest remained steady and strong. He turned to Lixa, his voice shaking. "This bond, it's the only reason we're alive, isn't it?" Lixa nodded, her silver eyes glowing faintly. Together, stronger. Ethan didn't know what that meant for their future, but one thing was clear: they were no longer just running for survival. Whatever this bond was, it was their only chance to fight back. The final stand. The forest was eerily silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan crouched behind a cluster of boulders, his heart pounding as he scanned the dark expanse ahead. The faint hum of the hunter's ship reverberated in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Next to him, Lixa sat cross-legged, her alien device glowing faintly in her hands. Her silver eyes were narrowed in concentration as she worked quickly, her fingers dancing over the holographic controls. Every so often, she would glance at Ethan, her expression a mix of determination and something softer, trust. "They're closing in," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. He clutched a crude makeshift weapon, an old metal pipe he'd scavenged earlier. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Lixa didn't look up from her device. "Not much time," she said, her voice strained. "Must finish." "Finish what?" Ethan demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We're sitting ducks here, and I don't even know what you're doing." Lixa's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment, the faint glow of her skin brightened. "Trap," she said simply. "For them." Ethan blinked. "A trap? You're building a trap?" She nodded, returning her focus to the device. "Hunters. Follow signal. Device. Amplify bond. Draw them. Here." Ethan's stomach churned. "You're using us as bait." "Not just bait," Lixa said, her voice firm. "Weapon too." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. The truth was, they had no other options. Running hadn't worked, and hiding only delayed the inevitable. If they didn't take a stand now, they wouldn't survive the night. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steadying. "What do you need me to do?" Lixa's lips curved into a faint smile, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "Stay close. Protect. Protect you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're the one with the glowing alien tech. Shouldn't you be protecting me?" Lixa shook her head, her expression serious. "Bond. Strong. You. Key. Key to what?" Ethan asked, but before she could answer, a deafening roar shook the forest. The hunter's ship broke through the canopy above, its massive, sleek form cutting through the darkness like a predator on the hunt. Searchlights swept the area, illuminating the trees in stark white light. "They're here," Ethan muttered, gripping the pipe tighter. Lixa stood, her device humming louder now. She pressed a final button, and a dome of shimmering blue energy erupted around them, enclosing their position. The air buzzed with electricity, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice rising in alarm. "Shield," Lixa said, "but not hold long." The ship hovered overhead, its engines roaring as it aimed its weapons at the glowing dome. Ethan could see the faint outline of figures inside the cockpit, humanoid shapes, watching them with cold precision. "What now?" Ethan asked, his throat dry. "Now," Lixa said, her voice steady, "we fight." Before Ethan could respond, the ship unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, each one slamming into the shield with a deafening crack. The dome flickered but held, the energy rippling like water under pressure. Lixa staggered slightly, her hands glowing as she fed more power into the device. Ethan gritted his teeth. "I'm guessing this thing doesn't have unlimited power." Lixa shook her head, her voice strained. "No, but enough." "Enough for what?" She looked at him, her silver eyes blazing with determination. To end this. The hunters, realizing the shield wasn't breaking, descended from the ship. They were tall, armored figures with glowing weapons that crackled with energy. Their movements were deliberate, predatory, as they surrounded the dome. Ethan's grip on the pipe tightened. Great. They brought friends. Lixa stepped closer to him, her voice low but firm. Stay. Together. Bond. Stronger. Ethan wanted to ask what she meant, but there was no time. The hunters raised their weapons, aiming at the shield, and Lixa's device emitted a high-pitched whine. The blue dome began to collapse inward, its energy condensing into a concentrated point between them. What's happening? Ethan asked, panic creeping into his voice. Power. Transfer, Lixa said. She grabbed his hand, and a surge of warmth flooded through him. The energy from the device coursed into their bodies, merging with the bond that connected them. Ethan's vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt as if he were seeing through her eyes, feeling her strength, her determination, her fear. When his vision cleared, the dome was gone, but the hunters had stopped in their tracks. The energy from the shield now radiated from Ethan and Lixa, surrounding them in a shimmering aura that pulsed with raw power. Ethan stared at his hands, which glowed faintly with the same blue light. What is this? Lixa smiled faintly, her voice soft but confident. Us. Together. The hunters hesitated, their weapons raised but their movements uncertain. One of them stepped forward, barking something in their alien tongue. Lixa responded in kind, her tone sharp and unyielding. What did you say? Ethan asked. Told them. Last chance, Lixa said, her expression hard. Leave or end. The hunter laughed, a cold, metallic sound, and raised his weapon. But before he could fire, the energy around Ethan and Lixa surged outward in a blinding flash, knocking the hunters off their feet. Ethan felt the power coursing through him, his fear replaced by a strange, exhilarating confidence. He stepped forward, his voice steady. You heard her. Leave. The hunters scrambled to their feet, their leader hesitating before barking a command. The ship's engines roared to life, and the figures retreated, disappearing into the darkness. As silence fell over the forest, Ethan turned to Lixa, his chest heaving. What just happened? She smiled faintly, her eyes glowing softly. Bond. Protect. Together. Unstoppable. For the first time since this began, Ethan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. A new beginning. The morning sun barely broke through the canopy of the dense forest as Ethan and Lixa stood on a ridge, looking out over the vast, untouched landscape. The hunters were gone, retreating back to their ship, leaving only a lingering sense of unease in the air. The battle was over for now, but something in the air had changed, something permanent. Ethan turned to Lixa, his breath still coming in short bursts from the confrontation. Her silver eyes were soft, her body slightly trembling from the intense energy she channeled. She had been weakened, but she hadn't faltered. And neither had he. We made it, he said, his voice more a statement than a question. Lixa nodded, her gaze distant, as if she was processing something far beyond this moment. Bond. Strong. Protect. Done. Ethan glanced at his hands, still faintly glowing with the energy that had surged through them during the battle. He could feel it in his bones now, this new connection between them. His body wasn't just adapting to hers, it was becoming a part of her, and she a part of him. He felt it in his heart, in his mind, a constant, unspoken link that was more than physical. It was something deeper, something they shared now, something that couldn't be broken. Lixa, he said, his voice quiet. What happens now? She didn't immediately respond, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. For a moment, Ethan thought she might not answer, but then she turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes shone with a mix of gratitude and something more, something softer, more vulnerable. We go forward, Lixa said simply, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions made. Together. Ethan let her words settle in the air between them. They weren't just allies anymore, not just a human helping an alien. They had crossed a line, a threshold. What they had now was uncharted territory, a bond so strong that it was almost more than he could comprehend. But it was real. He glanced over at the remnants of the ship that had hovered in the sky, now far behind them. It was gone, but the knowledge that there were others like them, others who would seek them out, loomed over his thoughts. Their fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. "I don't know what's out there, Lixa," Ethan said, his voice low. "But I do know one thing." Lixa raised an eyebrow, her silver eyes watching him intently. "I'm not running anymore. Not from you. Not from them." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Not alone, human." Ethan felt the weight of her words sink in. No, not alone. There was no turning back. The bond they shared had irrevocably changed him. He wasn't the same person he had been before this all started, not after everything they had been through. And Lixa. Lixa wasn't the same either. Whatever her people had intended for her, she had broken free of that fate. And now they were together, facing whatever came next. The wind shifted, and for the first time since he had met Lixa, Ethan felt something more than fear. He felt anticipation, anticipation for the unknown, for the journey ahead. Lixa stepped closer to him, her presence steady and grounding. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. A spark of energy shot through their connected fingers, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the world around them faded away for just a moment, and it was only the two of them, standing together on the edge of something new. "Where do we go now?" Ethan asked, his voice full of a quiet hope. Lixa looked back at him, her eyes reflecting the early morning light. "Wherever we choose." Together, they walked forward, their steps synchronized, their bond unbreakable. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, stronger than they ever could have imagined. And for the first time, Ethan truly understood the meaning of their connection. It wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. And they had chosen each other.